Welcome to our September 13th Equine Management Series. As part of our Equine Pasture Management Series, this kind of fits into both realms. We're very fortunate today to have a guest speaker. Dr. Jenny Ivey, our UT Equine Specialist, has joined us to hit on some very relevant topics as we start to come into our fall session. Especially here in Middle Tennessee, we're starting to getting some cooler weather. We've got a lot of rainfall, which is starting to green up and lush up our pastures, which then can lead to some issues on down the line that we might see with some of our lusher pastures and things that we might typically see in the springtime type season. So in order to try to handle this topic, we have Dr. Ivey joining us here today. So I will turn it over to Dr. Ivey, and we will begin from there. Welcome, Dr. Ivey.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. I'm glad to be here with everybody. I'm going to quickly share my presentation here, so hopefully you all can see this. And then we'll go ahead and get started. That look okay for you? Can you see that?
Looks good to me.
All right, perfect. So in kind of thinking about one of the areas that I get a lot of questions on every fall is, people worried about letting their horses out and grazing on the grass, but there's not a lot of understanding as to why this might be a problem, what horses this might affect, and then how do we manage it. So I wanted to kind of cover some of these topics with you today. We're going to kind of move through examples of what laminitis is, how it can be affected, what you need to look for, and how we can manage it overall. Okay. So to start off with what laminitis is. So if you look to the pictures to the right, the top picture on kind of the left alignment here shows you kind of if we pulled the hoof wall and the hard structure of the hoof off, we've got some indentations there. And then the middle picture shows you what would almost be left on the inside. And so what the lamina is this sensitive tissue that acts as Velcro, essentially. So if you look at those two pictures, the top one and the middle one, you can think about all those little fibers essentially locking together. And that's what helps to support the internal structures of the hoof and against the hoof wall. And so any real disruption of this particular integrity of that tissue will cause that Velcro to not be as strong. And so if you look at the bottom image, okay, so right down here is where we would expect that lamina to be. Okay, and it also would sit right on the top of this coffin bone, okay, or this triangular kind of shaped bone on a cross section that sits entirely within the hoof capsule. And so what happens is that this lamina, the sensitive tissue, a variety of things can cause it to either become inflamed or lose its structure and not be able to hold that Velcro, so to speak, intact as well. All right, and the biggest component here is if you look towards the back of the horse's foot, right here is something called the deep digital flexor tendon, and it runs all the way up and down the horse's leg, and it's responsible for helping that horse to bend and pick up its foot as it moves. Well, this tendon is so strong that when the lamina becomes compromised and doesn't hold up to the front of the hoof as well, this tendon actually pulls backwards, and that's what can cause that downward rotation of the coffin bone in really severe laminitis cases. And so a couple just kind of terminology things for you. We do kind of think about laminitis versus founder in two different settings. Okay, so laminitis is any sort of inflammation of that sensitive lamina. And this could be from a very small degree, very quickly, or acute, which is something that rapidly onsets, or something that's chronic that changes over time. So we're having repeated issues of problems with the integrity of that lamina. The other thing to keep in mind is that founder is really a term associated with the rotation of the coffin bone. So normally this coffin bone would sit parallel to the hoof wall. Oops, sorry about that. Would sit parallel to the hoof wall, but in cases of founder, this coffin bone will rotate and sometimes even poke through the sole of the foot. So all of those together are why we really care about laminitis. And if you think about maybe the way it feels if you get something stuck up underneath your fingernail, that's kind of what we've been able to associate the pain of laminitis with in horses. So it's something that we take very seriously, and obviously with the amount of weight that's put on the horse's legs, specifically their front feet, is where we see laminitis most frequently. This can be a really, really debilitating disease. And because of that, a survey that was done back in 2006, but the data is still pretty relevant now, the USDA looked at horse owners and asked them a variety of questions about their horse's health. And what they found was that two of the most common reasons why horse owners were seeking veterinary care is the fact that horses were either colicking or had laminitic problems. So this is something that we know affects lots of horses in the United States and actually in other countries as well every single year. In 2006, 13% of the owners that were surveyed had said that they had issues with laminitis within the last 12 months. So that's a pretty good subset of the population that's dealing with this particular issue, okay? And of those people that reported an issue, that 13%, 5% of those people reported that they had to either euthanize or their horse died because of laminitis itself. Okay, so that's not to scare you and say, that all of your horses are going to get laminitis this year, but it's just to give you an illustrating point to say that this is really something that horse owners deal with regularly and we should be aware of. So how is it caused, right? So we know that laminitis is that inflammation of the lamina, but a variety of things can cause this to happen. So things like concussion, or what we call road founder, literally just repeated concussion of the horse's hooves on some sort of a hard surface can cause inflammation to that lamina. Retained placenta, so for horses that are reproducing and giving birth, that placenta not being passed in an appropriate amount of time can cause a variety of different changes from a physiology perspective that can result in laminitis, okay? Hormonal imbalance is also a key player here. So for horses that are suffering maybe from Cushing's disease or issues with their, what they call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which basically is a really complicated way of talking about how the body signals from the brain, or the hypothalamus in particular, and then how that hormone actually will go through the body and impact a variety of different other mechanisms. Okay, corticosteroid use, so even some medications that we will utilize that are prescribed by a veterinarian can also impact laminitis onset. And the last two that we're going to look at here, grain overload and lush grass obesity. And so even though we talk about these kind of separately, the concept is still the same. So what's happening in the body and what's happening to the horse from a physiology perspective is actually almost identical when we think about these two topics. And so grain overload, most horse owners know that we don't want the horse to get into the grain bin, right? We don't want them to open that feed room door and just go to town on their concentrate. The same concept is also true when our grass is really lush and has a lot of non-structural carbohydrates, which we'll talk about a lot here in just a couple minutes. And that can also be impacted negatively by obesity. So over 50% of the cases that we see presenting for laminitis are typically dietary related. Okay, so that's a really good subset of horses that hopefully through good management, we can prevent laminitis onset. Okay. So what would you look for in your horse? So there's something called the OBEL grading system that can help you as an owner relay information to your veterinarian about what your horse is exhibiting, okay? But if you look at the picture here, the way this horse is standing is really characteristic of a horse with laminitis. So about 60% of the horse's weight is actually held on the front limbs alone. And so when their front feet are especially tender, horses will actually rock their weight back to the hind end and kind of stand with those hind limbs more underneath of them to help lift weight off of the front feet. Okay, so that kind of rocked back stance is very indicative of a horse that has a laminitic issue. The grading system itself goes from 1 to 4. And 1, you're going to see maybe the horse alternating lifting their feet. Also very similar to maybe what you would see for a horse that has an abscess. Okay, that horse that's kind of toe pointing and holding their foot up, but instead of it just being 1 foot, now they're going to rock back and forth between the two. An OBEL scale of 2 would be the horse is resisting to walking or turning at the walk and just walking at the trot, walking in a straight line and also turning at the walk. And the horse would be lame at the trot. So just, exactly what you would think of, kind of that head bobbing lame that we would expect. An OBEL system of 3, the horse is going to be lame at the walk itself, very stilted. So they may not have a lot of normal limb action and a lot of angular movement of their joints. And the horse may even resist lifting their feet. So if you think about it, in order for that horse to pick up a foot, right, just like for you when you walk, I have to shift my weight to 1 foot. And that puts a lot of extra pressure on that structure, that laminitic structure that's already tender. So the horse will a lot of times not really want to pick up their feet. And 4 is this horse is really, really in a lot of pain, and they will not move unless they're absolutely forced to do so. What we also know about laminitis is that rotation of the coffin bone, or total separation of those two sides of the lamina, can be seen about 48 to 72 hours after the pain onsets. So it's not to say that if you see your horse having, maybe some foot pain, that it's 100% guaranteed that in 48 hours the rotation is going to happen on their coffin bone. But it's a good indicator for you to be able to look at and say, okay, I know we're having this issue. Get your vet out to look at your horse and engage in some management strategies to help prevent laminitis from progressing. Okay, and obviously there's a variety of factors that will impact coffin bone rotation and separation and severity of that laminitic bout. So this is a really good conversation to have with your veterinarian if you're worried about your horse suffering from laminitis, or if they've had laminitic problems in the past. The other key point to remember, whether it's for your horse or a horse you're looking at maybe to purchase in the future, is that some horses we do see laminitis reoccurring frequently. And this could be because of genetic factors, it could be because of management, or a combination of them. But we do seem to note a recurring laminitic bout issue in a lot of horses. And that's what we would classify as more of a chronic laminitis case. Okay. So what are the risk factors here? So from the animal side, we know that obesity is a huge problem, okay? And from maybe how long that horse has been obese. So this isn't necessarily to say that, maybe over the winter or in through the spring when your horse maybe has access to more lush pasture, which obviously is a concern from what we'll talk about here in a few minutes, but they may put on some extra pounds, okay? And then maybe those pounds kind of shut off as you ride through the summer. We don't see as many issues with kind of fluctuating obesity as we see with those horses that are obese for many years of their life. The other, maybe more important area of obesity is regional adiposity or regional obesity. And this horse in the bottom picture, this bay horse, is experiencing some pretty severe regional adiposity. So all of these kind of pockets of fat that you're seeing are areas where that fat has been laid down more specifically there than in other regions. Okay, and so what we see is that there's a correlation between neck crest fat, or on this gray horse over here. So where my mouse is running kind of down this line on their neck is what we call the nuchal ligament. And then all of this fat up here in the neck crest, we know that that height of the neck crest is actually associated with insulin resistance and then potentially metabolic syndrome within the body. And so if you have a horse that has a really big neck crest that looks like this, even if they're maybe not really obese overall, this could be a really good indicating factor that your horse may have some insulin resistant issues. The neck crest actually, kind of correlating this back to humans, is the type 2 diabetic or the metabolic syndrome in humans, where they look at abdominal circumference as the major indicating factor. This is where we see neck crest fat kind of taking that place in the horse world. On the dietary side, the bigger player that we're kind of concerned with is something called non-structural carbohydrates. And we'll discuss this a lot, excuse me, as we move through. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it now, but you'll see me utilize that abbreviation, non-structural carbohydrates, or NSC, quite a bit as we go through here. And really all this means is that these are carbohydrates that are not or should not necessarily be fermented in the horse's body. So there's different enzymes that the horse has that allows them to break them down in the forebar of their gut and then absorb them just like we do. So things like glucose, fructose, and different sugars that the horse can utilize, hopefully, in the beginning of their gut. Okay. The other thing is that harvest conditions or growing conditions can really impact the amount of non-structural carbohydrates that we see within different dietary components. Then the last is feed type. So we know that grains, specifically corn, barley, oats, things like that are going to have a much higher non-structural carbohydrate content than maybe some of our grasses. And then even within grasses, there may be a little bit of variety depending on season and, again, harvest and growing conditions. So we're going to kind of dive a little bit farther into the dietary factors as we go through the last little bit. Okay. So pasture-associated laminitis. So now we're going to kind of hone in really on what specifically triggers what we consider this pasture-driven laminitic problem, okay? And unfortunately, what we do know is that it is a nutritional problem, that there's something about the diet that causes this condition, but the exact mechanism is largely unknown. And the reason that that's important is that, as you maybe as a horse owner, or maybe you're a veterinarian, or if you talk to me as a nutritionist, we do the best that we can to try and manage the conditions and the management setting that your horse is in. But unfortunately, there may be some other impact factors on the back end that also can contribute to the fact that your horse may be more predisposed to pasture-associated laminitis than other horses. But largely what we know is that there's some metabolic or digestive disturbance that happens when the horse eats a variety of different foodstuffs in larger quantities than what their body can handle. And so I think the best way to think about this is maybe, members of your family, right? So I know for me, my husband has a really sensitive stomach. So we can eat the exact same meal prepared at the exact same time, and I feel fine, but it'll upset his stomach. So we see the same thing in horses. Some horses can go out and graze the same pasture for the same period of time and have no issues. And another horse in that particular herd can go out and graze and have a variety of problems. So knowing your horse and knowing kind of what management pieces you need to be aware of will be very helpful in figuring out a nutritional plan for them. But with regard to pasture laminitis, what we know happens is that horses consume an excessive amount of sugar, fructan, and starch, whether that be from the grain overload or from when pasture and growing grasses accumulate a lot of these for a variety of different reasons. And so what we see is that as that foodstuff comes in the horse's mouth and goes into the stomach, ideally, all of these sugars and starches would be digested and absorbed in the small intestine. When a horse has an excessive amount and they can't accomplish that task within the small intestine, it spills over into the cecum or into the hindgut. And that cecum is the site for fermentation in the horse. So all of the microbes that are back there that we need to help that horse digest a variety of complex carbohydrates, like fiber and things like that, now those microbes are going to take a crack at these sugars, starches, and specifically fructans that the horses can't digest in that foregut. And so what happens in a bunch of different steps, but the overall picture is that pH back there decreases, makes it very acidic. Bacteria that are back there produce a variety of toxins. And overall, this is what we know ends up in laminitis and colic in some cases. Okay, but again, that mechanism of exactly how that happens, there's a lot of pieces that are still missing. So researchers over the last decade or so have been able to impact the horse's digestive tract to mimic pasture-associated laminitis through experimental models. And so what they found is that they were able to induce a laminitic bout with a dose of about 17 grams per kilogram of the horse's body weight through an oral starch solution or an oligofructose solution, which basically is fructose that's linked together in a big molecule that eventually will become a fructan or similar to a fructan in the horse's normal diet. So to kind of help you get an idea of what these pieces are and why we care about them, because we're going to talk about them a lot from a management perspective, we had to think about what's actually inside of the plant cell that your horse is eating, and then what's actually made up on the outside of that cell and what we call the cell wall. Okay, so the internal contents, this is where the protein is, the vitamins are, all of the things that the horse needs to get. But from a simple carbohydrate side or a non-structural carbohydrate side, these are the pieces that we're concerned about. Okay, so we have starch and fructan. These are going to be the larger kind of storage molecules. And then we have something called a monosaccharide or a single sugar molecule. So this is glucose, fructose, and sucrose is going to be a disaccharide. So glucose and fructose bound together in a dimer or a two-part form. Okay, so sucrose, starch, fructose, and glucose are all hydrolyzed or digested in the small intestine by enzymes that the horse's body produces. And in theory, this is where, again, all of those molecules would be absorbed and put into the bloodstream before that digestion moves on to the large intestine. Okay, if we look at the cell wall portion, okay, we have hemicellulose and cellulose. Both of these are fermentable but not digestible, so we see them primarily utilized within the hindgut. Lignin is another cell wall component, and this is not digestible or fermentable by the horse. And so we see lignin increase as the plant gets more mature. So that's kind of where we look at that as a marker of intake and some others from your forage test if you've got one. So what happens, again, is as these simple carbohydrates are not absorbed in the small intestine, they'll spill over into the hindgut, like I mentioned, and become rapidly fermented. And these are the ones that we're concerned about, specifically fructan, because fructan actually does not get digested at all within the small intestine. So this one goes directly into the large intestine, and those microbes can get a really good crack at it, especially if there's a lot of it within the forage. All right, so what about the grass? What about this pasture that we're worried about for you in the fall, right? So we know that those plants contain the simple sugars, fructans and starch, like I just showed you. But we've got our cool season grasses and our warm season grasses, okay? The C3 grasses or cool seasons, they primarily store their sugars as fructans, all right? And then our C4 grasses or warm season grasses primarily store sugars as starches. So this is why if we look down kind of in the growing season, okay, our cool seasons or the blue line, you can see that they primarily grow at a faster rate during the cooler months, right? February, March, April being the peak, and then we kind of see it die off and they go more dormant in the warmer months of the summer and then pick back up in the fall. So this is why when we think about the fact that fructan's not digested by the horse and it moves all the way over into the large intestine to be fermented, and the fact that they accumulate faster in the cooler months, so the spring and the fall, is why we tend to see a lot of issues with pasture-associated laminitis in those two seasons specifically. Okay, so that's not to say that we don't see any issues with it in the summer, but usually for the horses that are really sensitive to this type of laminitis, they're the ones that are going to have issues also in the warm season periods. Okay, there is a little bit that goes into this with regard to the size and the shape of the different fructan molecules that are present. And I didn't want to bore you with a lot of biochemistry, but if you have questions about that, please let me know. So the other impact factors that I mentioned to you earlier is what about the environment? So we know that the intensity of sunlight and how long the days are actually sunny for will impact the amount of photosynthesis that plant completes during the day. And as a byproduct of photosynthesis, the plant will store sugars, okay? Like I said, cool seasons usually in the form of fructan, and warm seasons usually in the form of starch. They'll have mixtures of the others, but those are their primary storage forms. Water availability is also important. So drought can impact sugar storage. The nitrogen status and the soil fertility are also big players in how much sugar is stored by the plant. And then the ambient temperature outside. So I created this little chart and I adapted it from a couple different publications, but I hope if you don't take anything else away from this, that you think about this chart when you manage your horses for pasture-associated laminitis, okay? So I've got a variety of different stressors on the left-hand side that will all impact non-structural carbohydrate content within the plants, okay? We've got our C3 or our cool season grasses, things like timothy, fescue, orchard grass, ryegrass. There's a variety of others that will go in there as well, but those are the most common that we see for horse diets. And then our warm season, so things like Bermuda grass, teff grass, crabgrass, those are all going to be kind of in this warm season category. All right. So if we think about cold temperatures, this is about below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. Remember, cool seasons grow really well in the cooler temperatures. So in this setting, typically the non-structural carbohydrates will get higher. Okay. The grasses are growing fairly well. And this happens until the stem base is no longer green. So if you walk out into your pastures maybe in December, and look at the bottom of the stem base and it's yellow, these plants are probably not putting down as much non-structural carbohydrate as they were maybe in September or October, or maybe even February or March. Okay, on the opposite side, the warm seasons that don't grow well in these cooler temperatures, they're not going to be laying down a lot of non-structural carbohydrate at this time. All right, and the opposite is true for warm, right? So if we've got warm temperatures, the cool seasons will be lower in non-structural carbohydrates, and the warm seasons will be higher, okay? So think about or maybe identify what pasture plants you've got out in your fields and be able to make an educated guess about what you're looking at based on the growth level that you're seeing. All right, what about light intensity? So non-structural carbohydrates are always going to be lowest in the early morning if the night was above 41 degrees, and then we can default back up to those top two if we have any questions about temperature. Okay. And what happens is that if it's warm enough overnight, that plant utilizes those sugars to accomplish life-sustaining things overnight. And so we know that those sugars are depleted in the early morning, which might make it a better time for those horses that are prone to laminitis to graze. Okay. We know that non-structural carbohydrates will be the highest in the late afternoon. So that's usually why when we recommend what times of day horses can go out and graze if they're really sensitive to this, we encourage people to turn them out in the early morning and pull them off usually by about noon, but definitely wait to turn them out until maybe after 3, 4, 5 o'clock when those NSCs are going to be much higher. Okay. Cloudy conditions or grass that's in the shade is going to greatly reduce the non-structural carbohydrate accumulation. Again, because we're out of that direct sunlight, we don't have as much photosynthesis occurring. So what about drought? So if there's a lack of water for more than 5 days, the plant starts to really store and hold on to non-structural carbohydrates in preparation for not being able to make a lot in the event that we don't get any more rain. Okay, so if we know that we've been kind of a dry period for about a week or so, it might trigger a red flag for you to say, I shouldn't let my horses graze for as long as I would if we've had active rain. Okay, also as we come out of that short drought, if you will, the new shoots are going to be much higher in NSC immediately with that rainfall, because that plant's going to say, okay, I've got some water, I'm going to grow, I'm going to utilize this and be able to really put down a lot of nutrient and size in that plant. So keep those two things in mind. Okay. Also for grazing and mowing. So grazing and mowing encourages that plant to continue its growth period. So anytime that you've cut your grass, usually the first few days after, NSC content will increase just ever so slightly. So we encourage you to mow, low enough to remove the seed heads, use good pasture management, just like your extension agents are recommending to you, but recognize that those first few days after mowing can impact the NSC content independently. Okay, so I know this is really challenging, but there's a very easy take-home message for this. And this was a study that was done in spring pastures, but what I want to show you is that during the day, okay, so we're going to look over here on the right-hand side, here's non-structural carbohydrate content in the forage and time of day on the bottom, okay? So all this is showing you is that at 6 a.m., right, non-structural carbohydrate content was lowest. It peaks at about 6 p.m. or 1800 military time, and then drops at about 6 a.m. and peaks at about 6 p.m. So this is exactly what we just mentioned on the previous slide, right? We want to graze in the early morning hours and pull those horses off of the pasture during the late afternoon after they've had the sun all day long to complete photosynthesis, okay? On the backside, what we know is that horse that maybe has insulin resistance problems or already has high circulating insulin, the circulating levels of this particular hormone that pulls sugar out of the bloodstream and puts it back into the tissues also fluctuates with very similar to the way the grass's non-structural carbohydrate content looks, right? So we see a peak maybe a little bit delayed, but still comes up right at about 1800 in the horses that are grazing, comes back down when we see the grass non-structural carbohydrate at its lowest, and then picks back up. Okay, so that's something really important to remember. Again, graze early in the morning and pull them off by the afternoon if we've got horses that we're concerned about. Okay, also our cool season grasses are typically going to be higher in non-structural carbohydrates than warm season grasses. And so overall what we've got here is the fact that grass hay normally ranges between 8 to 18%. And then the legume hay, so things like alfalfa and lespedeza, bird's foot trefoil, all of those that kind of can get lumped into the legume category usually are a little bit lower, and sometimes I've seen them even lower than that 8%. Okay, oat hay are grains, you may even seen these represented as straw, typically tend to be much higher. So this isn't a particular forage source that I would recommend for a horse that we know is worried, or we have an owner that's worried for their horse about a laminitic problem. Okay. And I put this up here just to kind of help you, because we're going to talk here in just a second about recommendations for horses from a dietary perspective. And so I added this particular section in here to show you alfalfa pellets, right, a legume, tend to be lower in NSC, and compare that to maybe oats or corn, right, two very common components of commercial horse rations. Okay, NSC content of 54 for oats and 73 for corn. All right, so if we're looking at a way to manage a horse that's already really sensitive to non-structural carbohydrates within the pasture, these two areas are going to be really, really important for us to cut out, or anything that's really above this 10% non-structural carbohydrate. Okay, and a lot of times people ask me, well, I thought non-structural carbohydrates was just the combination of sugar and starch. And it is to a certain extent, but not exactly. So the chemical analysis that we run to get these numbers, we can't just exactly add them together. So if you look at these two columns and then try and compare them to the non-structural carb content, it's pretty close, but not exactly the straight addition. Okay, so what are our options for your horses that are having issues with this? Okay, the number one thing that I recommend to horse owners is that usually when we've got problems with pasture-associated laminitis, the first thing we want to do is have that horse lose weight. Because I'll bet you $1 that usually these horses tend to be very overweight, if not kind of borderline on the obese side. So we want you to really utilize the body condition scoring system at home. Most of the horses that we see having issues with pasture-associated laminitis fall in this 7 to 9 category. Okay, again, having a really high crusty neck, kind of this sausage midsection that kind of just blends together into the hindquarter, and what we call kind of this M-shaped rump, right? So this crease probably goes all the way down the middle section of their back. So if you think about your horse and what they look like at home, and if you think that they may have any of these kind of indicating factors, weight loss is probably something we would recommend for your horse. Okay, horse owners are really interesting in the sense that usually we like our horses to be really fat, and we want ourselves to be really thin. So we kind of have to switch that mentality back and get them into the more moderate, or maybe the 4 to 6 range. Okay. We also can utilize exercise to help with this kind of goal. The problem being that if your horse is experiencing laminitic bouts and they're lame, exercise is not really an option. So we really rely very heavily on dietary restriction to achieve weight loss. And this can be a really frustrating thing for horse owners because it takes a long time, sometimes 4 to 6 weeks, to really start to see a change if it's done safely. So really, staying dedicated to those changes that we'll talk about here next is very important. So once we talk about weight loss as a whole, that's its own kind of component, we then want to limit non-structural carbohydrates in the diet. So we do that by making really educated dietary choices, usually by encouraging a forage test or something similar. We provide management strategies for grazing and for a variety of different to limit those non-structural carbs. And then we also are going to aim for a non-structural carbohydrate content at or near 10% of that horse's diet. And so research has shown us that levels of this particular amount in the horse's diet allow them to safely be able to graze or consume forages and not see a lot of issues with pasture-associated laminitis or forage-associated laminitis overall. Okay, so how do you make a decision for your horses? What can you do? So the non-structural carbohydrate content, okay, is reflective of the amount that was present in the plant when it was cut and during the drying process. So if you ask your hay producer, what time of day was this hay cut, if you can ask them that question. If it was cut in the morning, just like you would expect if that horse was to go out and graze in the morning, the non-structural carbohydrate content will be lower than if it was cut later in the afternoon. Okay, forages will also respire and complete photosynthesis after they've been cut, and they'll lose sugars to a certain percent until about moisture is about 40% of the total. And so what that means is that during the drying process, if it was really hot, really dry, and very sunny, okay, that hay is going to be a little bit higher in non-structural carbohydrates because not as much would have been lost as if it was cured in a slower, drier, more humid setting, because it would take more time and respiration would continue and provide us with a lower non-structural carbohydrate content. Okay, so ask your hay producer these questions if you can, but ultimately these are really educated guesses for us. Okay, so a forage test is key. There's a variety of other factors, like we said, whether it's soil fertility, whether it's how much water was actually, raining on the field or being watered while that plant was growing. Also, if the hay was rained on, during the curing process or after, all of these things can impact non-structural carbohydrates along with other nutrients. So the forage test is really key. Okay. There's also lots of abbreviations, and they can get really confusing. So I put these up there mainly for your reference. Okay, we talked about the non-structural carbohydrates overall, and this kind of contains everything. It's the whole melting pot of the issues that we're worried about. Okay, we also have something called water-soluble carbohydrates. So this is just the simple sugars, okay, so the mono, the single units, and the di, or the 2-unit sugars. And then what we call the oligofructoses, okay, those are the fructans. And then we have something called ESC, or the simple sugars only. So sometimes you'll see reported on a forage test all of these different components, or some people will utilize just the ESC component and starch, because these two are actually the ones that will impact the insulin mechanism within the body. Okay, they're the ones that trigger that insulin peak. So usually most nutritionists will hopefully have a non-structural carbohydrate number to go off of, and then also the ESC and starch as well. So both of these are going to be very important. Okay, another option that we can utilize, and I would say most horse owners are probably aware of this, is soaking the hay. So what happens is that the sugars, okay, so what we're looking at here are going to be the mono and disaccharides, and to some extent the starches and fructans, okay? Those are water soluble. So by soaking the hay, we can hopefully pull some of those out and drop the amount of non-structural carbohydrate content overall within that hay. Okay. The problem here is that there's other nutrients that your horse does need from the hay that are also water soluble. So things like different minerals, right? Sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, all of those are going to be water soluble. Same thing with some protein. So we know that we lose some of that during the soaking process. Okay. The other challenge is that we only can drop the non-structural carbohydrate content by about 2 to 3% by soaking. So what that means is that if you have a NSC content hay of maybe 18%, I'm only going to be able to maybe get that to 15% by soaking it, which still is above that 10% level. So again, the forage test is really important for you. A 30-minute maximum if you're soaking in hot water, and a 60-minute maximum soaking in cold water. And please, 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 if you're going to soak your horse's hay in either temperature water, pour the water out before you feed it to your horse. Because if not, and they go back and they just drink all that sugar water, you've really done nothing to reduce the non-structural carbohydrate content overall. Okay, so soak the hay, dump the water, and then feed it. And the last piece I want to talk to you about is managing turnout. Okay, so this is usually one that our horse owners utilize most frequently, and is restricting the grazing times, right? So we want to avoid those really cold nights followed by sunny days, because we know that that'll jack up the non-structural carbohydrate content. We want to graze early in the morning and overnight, as opposed to in the afternoon or during the sunny parts of the day. If it's been overcast for the day or really shady, that's a much better day to let that horse graze a little bit longer than if it's been really sunny. Okay, grazing muzzles are also an option. And I'm going to steal Dr. Strickland, our extension veterinarian's comment here, that horses are either homicidal or suicidal. And so I've seen a lot more issues with grazing muzzles and horses getting hurt, sometimes that they can help. So I would rather see a horse owner try and really manage grazing time if they can in their schedule before we move to a grazing muzzle. The other piece is that some owners are really concerned about not letting their horses graze at all. And unfortunately, that can sometimes be one of the things that we're going to recommend because of how sensitive these horses are, especially horses that maybe have Cushing's disease or some other metabolic problems that are kind of complicating this pasture-associated laminitis issue. And so what we see here is that avoiding maybe the pasture situation as a whole and going to a dry lot. Okay, so this is really where we're turning that horse out maybe just on dirt or a sacrifice lot and providing hay that we know meets that low non-structural carbohydrate requirement and will also meet that horse's needs overall. Okay, so that's most of what I have for you today. I put in a shameless plug here for our field days because they kick off tomorrow night in the central region. But the middle Tennessee area where you all are, our field day is September 21st, next Thursday, down in Spring Hill. So if you're interested, we're going to be covering herbicide management, how to balance weeds in your pasture, toxic plants to horses, and other issues that might cause your horse harm. Dr. Bates, our forage specialist, will be covering how to assess your hay from a physical standpoint to get an indicator of what might be contained from a nutrition side. And then I'll be finishing up with the nutritive value of forages overall and what that could provide for your horse from its dietary perspectives. So if you're interested, please RSVP using my information up there, and hopefully we'll see you there. And I'm glad to take any questions that you all might have.